So many of you will remember Serpil interviewing Sarah Shams from the Start Foundation. And if you've been into the expo, you may even have seen part of a telephone call that we had setting that up. And Serpil interviewed Sarah about how she got her prosthetic legs to run the Bridge to Brisbane run, and the teamwork and collaboration that took in made that happen. And Serpil and James from Written Recorded made it, and it's just a wonderful conversation. So Serpil is the co-founder of Written Recorded, a content marketing agency with journalism at its core. They specialise in podcast production, SEO, copywriting and communications training. Through the craft of storytelling, Written and Recorded helps businesses get discovered by humans and search engines. Prior to setting up Written and Recorded, Serpil spent over 20 years in Australia's mainstream media as a journalist, broadcaster and content creator. She's worked in newspapers, television, radio and online. She's also been a presenter at events for the Wheeler Centre, Feminist Writers Festival and the City of Stottingham, to name a few. She's given some wonderful feedback for the speakers, and I've done one of her speaking workshops a while ago, and I'm always keen to learn more from her, and particularly now with the podcast that I'm producing, I'm waiting with bated breath. So over to you, and thank you.
Thank you for the warm intro, Kerryn, and I hope everyone can hear and see me. You're right, it is a bit like being on TV and not knowing if you're actually going live to air. So it was lovely to see some of you in the networking room, and for all those who haven't met me, as Kerryn said, my name is Serpil Chanel-Mesh, and today I'm going to talk to you about podcasting and how that can influence and drive change. But first, I want you to do some reflecting. Can you remember what it was like to be bored? What did that feel like for you? That weird sensation of doing nothing and being alone with your thoughts. Psychoanalyst Adam Phillips once described boredom in the New Yorker as that state of suspended animation in which things are started and nothing begins, the mood of diffused restlessness, which contains the most absurd and paradoxical wish, the wish for a desire. So I have this really strong memory sitting in an airport, in a transit lounge in Singapore with my parents. I was a kid. I was probably about sort of 10 years old at the time, and I was crumpled over in this really uncomfortable seat, sitting next to my parents. And I remember blurting out, "Mum, I'm bored." I felt really irritated and frustrated, and I had this empty feeling in the pit of my stomach. At the time, of course, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube, no Snapchat, and certainly no TikTok moves to get me dancing on the dance floor or to keep me occupied. In that moment, all I could think about was, I just want this dullness to end. Now, today, the opposite is true for most of us. Now, we have these endless distractions. There's a bajillion gadgets in our lives, and we're continuously feeding that boredom beast with entertainment snacks. We're skimming through the news, we're getting sucked into the vortex of social media, we're signing up to the latest streaming services, and we're embracing this culture of busyness because we're busy with just too much choice. And what this has done has created this tsunami of content, an overwhelming sea of information. And so when you're trying to be heard, it can be really challenging. That means if you're creating content as the face of your business or for your business, it's important to generate content at a frequency that can be heard so that you can be heard over all of that non-stop noise. So it's about creating a signal that really penetrates. And you can do this with podcasting and as a result, influence and drive change. Why podcasting? Well, with so many options constantly vying for our attention, The point of difference with podcasting is that it taps into our biological relationship with sound. As early as 25 weeks, babies in the womb have been shown to respond to voices and sounds. We know, for instance, that a baby in utero is more alert when they hear their mum speaking. And they demonstrate this with an increased heart rate, which is just super cute. Now, podcast listeners have a similar relationship with the voice of a presenter or the storyteller. Now, the other day, I found myself totally absorbed by the dulcet tones of Paul McGann as he took me on this historic journey of the world's tyrants. I was specifically fascinated with Stalin's rise to power. He had plotted for years to have a place at the decision-making table, and then when Lenin popped his clogs, after he had a stroke, he pounced at the opportunity to take charge. Yeah, it's true. I am listening to a podcast called Real Dictators right now. And sarcastically, I'm referring to it as a bit of light relief during this lockdown that we're having. Don't judge me. But see, I'm not alone in the emotional response I've had to this podcast. Millions of others have responded to audio in the same way that as I have. For instance, research shows that branded stories that are told just through audio inspire more positive emotional peaks than branded stories told just visually. In fact, it's an average of 50%. That is a pretty big number. Now, when you think about it, we've been using audio storytelling for thousands of years. It started with conversations around a campfire, and these stories went on to shape our cultures. In the book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, the author Yuval Noah Harari tells the power of storytelling and our need to create meaning. He says, "How does one convince millions of people to believe in particular stories about gods or nations or limited liability companies?" He suggests that storytelling enables millions of strangers to cooperate and work towards common goals. Now, while podcasting is a solitary pastime, it's the slice of life audio stories that capture the attention of our ears. Then they shape our perceptions, inspire actions, and spark conversations. And unlike the old school campfire, there's no geographical boundaries. But what exactly, or how exactly, can podcasts influence and drive change? Well, for one, they can give a voice to marginalised or overlooked communities. Now, a few years ago, I was obsessively listening to a series called Code Switch. It's an American series about race and culture, which shares personal stories, historical context, and in-depth analysis. And it's while listening to this particular series that I got a real understanding of the effects of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. I remember having a real physical reaction to hearing about the racial divide and inequity when it came to the US government's relief efforts. I felt a real sense of discomfort. Now, that story stayed with me for quite some time, but what I remembered wasn't the number of people killed during that tragedy. It was actually about the hardships that those who lived had to endure. By having that conversation, that podcast not only gave voice to marginalised communities, it also positioned itself to be able to shape public perceptions and influence policymakers. Similarly, some months ago, I just finished listening to a series called 1619, which was an audio series on how slavery transformed America. In that series, I discovered the voices of Black sugarcane farmers in Louisiana and how it became harder and harder to hold on to their land because of systemic racism. In Australia, we know that many stories go untold in mainstream media, and I've worked there for 20 years, I know, due to an overwhelming non-diverse media landscape. The latest report from Media Diversity Australia shows that only 6% of presenters, commentators, and reporters have either not an Indigenous or non-European background. So podcasting is a vehicle where untold stories can be shared. For businesses, brands, and thought leaders, it's the perfect opportunity to take the lead and put a spotlight on those untold stories. And the reality is, there's a commercial incentive to connect with and reflect a diverse audience because we are a multicultural country. How else can podcasts influence and drive change? Quite simply, by educating us. I recently executive produced a podcast series called How Science Matters for the Burnet Institute. They're key advisors to the Australian government's pandemic response. This podcast is an antidote to all of the misinformation and myths surrounding COVID-19 and the pandemic. If you haven't listened to it, please go ahead and download it. This series looks at how we got here and what comes next through the context of science. This is a series that's an example of how podcasts can be a powerful education tool. They're like having access to an endless library in your ears. And we know that education is the most influential instrument to be able to change hearts and minds. Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. The good news is, according to research from the ABC, 75% of podcast listeners hit play on their device because they want to learn something new or they want to brush up on something they already know. So businesses, brands, and thought leaders can tap into our appetite for lifelong learning and feed our sense of curiosity. One other way that podcasts can influence and drive change is by provoking and challenging us and introducing us to unexplored territories. A good audio story that gets to the essence of a topic and stirs emotions can inspire listeners to make a positive impact. It can even nudge listeners to take an action. So, can we be nudged to take action on climate change, for instance? Well, that is the exact question that is being asked and answered in the latest episode of the BBC podcast, The Climate Question. We know that when audio stories are told well, they produce oxytocin in our brains. That's the hormone of love, trust, and all things warm and fuzzy. For businesses, brands, and thought leaders, tapping into the issues we care about is an opportunity to build connection and trust. So that's just a few of the ways that podcasts can influence and drive change. If you're not a convert already, the next time you're folding your clothes, washing the car, walking the dog, or just doing anything that doesn't require thinking, remember, you can have something inspiring playing between your ears instead. Thanks everyone for lending me your ears tonight. Again, I'm Serpil Shenelmish, the co-founder of Written and Recorded, a content marketing agency. And as Kerryn said, one of our specialties is producing premium professional podcasts. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn or you can simply head to our website, writtenandrecorded.com. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's wonderful and very insightful. And when I started my podcast last year in lockdown, I should have had you backing behind me, but I have had some wonderful conversations with people right within the YTM community. So I had a podcast with Anna. I've had a podcast with Joanna de Burker from Just Peoples. I've had a podcast with Andrew Wilson and Andy Guild about bicycles of humanity, and they met at a YTM event. Had a post with Michelle Jelliff, how she got involved with START in the first place. I had one with Lee Powell about new thinking. One with the future of work, which was actually an event we ran at the end of last year where Harriet Warren, Lee, and our son spoke. And last week, I spoke to a girl in the Northern Territory who is working in a remote Indigenous school, and also a woman in Brisbane who runs the Carers Foundation. So, Serpil, I hear you. I'm trying to amplify and inspire through their stories, because there's so many people that we don't know exist, and we need to highlight the wonderful efforts, just like the speakers tonight are all doing their bit to influence and change. So thank you, and I hope that we might have inspired some other people to get on board. So thank you.